Yeah, but it's double backwards as well. Action.
Have you got the tune?
No.
No? Hello and welcome to
Good morning,
Athens. I'm Laurenzo and Phil, founder of the New Athens blockchain think tank, here with Philip Fiersov, stone carver, art historian, portraitist, traveller of antique land, and wood carver, artist of great repute, art historian, and many other things. And we're here today to discuss tilting at windmills, our quixotic wish to gain freedom again in 2020 and the means by which we might achieve that. And I think the first piece of media we have is Philip's degree show
2008
windmill at the Slade. And I think Philip should just take us through this to get a handle on where we are tilting windmills today.
Yeah, so the exhibition of 2008 was our degree show in what you can see behind the structure I made, which is the front of UCL. So the
courtyard
in London, University College London, one of the largest universities in the world, number 4, I think, in the world scale. So here I was as a young boy coming out of the small town to London and into the world. And soon after kind of a brief year in St. Martin's, applying to this prestigious art school. And of course, in the metropolis, a school that was set up as art for art's sake rather than art exists and what it's for. So you look at the history of the Slade, it's sort of very wealthy young aristocrats mingling in an art school run by people like Felix Slade. And in the time of the 18th century, a school set up for a not commercial but purely artistic raison d'etre. And that was very different to St. Martin's. So immediately the two colleges had belonged to the church, and it was of a guild of the Church of Carriage Makers, and so a lot more of an applied arts college. So going from an applied arts foundation course to essentially a college which was about art for art's sake. And so a very imperial Baroque framework in which to operate. So you'd arrive through the gates into this Palladian square with its observatories and large trees, that were in front of colonnades, statues, and columns and capitals. And you'd go into the front door of the Slade to be faced with a staircase, which led up and down into studio rooms in sort of white cube style. And you were given total freedom for 4 years. Throughout which you could learn languages, you could study anything in the university as a subsidiary course, and then you were supposed to produce a thesis and discuss art in a seminar format in order to then come out with a final outcome, which was a large percentage of the degree course. And so in the Slade, you're in the big city, here you are, totally free to do whatever you want. And I ended up with just over there by the tree, which actually had been dug up because they'd built an underground studio and put windows into the lawn. So it doesn't look like this. And, it's a very exciting opportunity funded by essentially like student loans and governments. And
so that's you don't see the money. The money is given by the government to the university to accept you as then an actor for then those 4 years.
So it's a limited amount of people, a much smaller context than St. Martin's or some of the other larger art colleges like Royal College or whatever. It's a very small school with a great legacy of people like Freud and Ewan Uglow and all these sort of classical traditions of
in our time
and things like that.
In our time, it was like £3,000 tuition fees per year. So you were then a token for the Slade School to apply to the state for this £3,600
which was all very easily done, and we were provided with housing, and for the first year, it was cheap to rent a small room in halls, and basically we were given all day and evening, and of course a large contingent of lecturers would come in and bring in sort of discussions on art and what the purpose and ideology of art was. And so having been through sort of 2 different parallel A-levels of photography and fine art at school in St Albans, and then also private tuition from a Russian artist who had gone through an academic kind of Russian training, and from my Russian background, having immigrated as a child from the falling Soviet Union, I had a cultural thing of being interested in Europe from an early age, and thanks to my family who are all composers, and I got to travel a lot, so I continued my travel. So this gave me a platform to go around with a video camera and film and photograph and draw in Europe, mainly because that's what I chose to explore art history further. And one of the main things that I came up against was a postmodern view and a history of art view that garnered the idea that art history began with the 20th century and Picasso, and quickly progressed into the postmodern surrealism, if you like.
Yeah.
Parallel universes.
So Picasso is you were telling me earlier, the start of their model of where art history goes. So Picasso was a visual artist in the age of the photograph, saying, what's left for me? Okay, so I move into the fantasia, I move into the surreal, I move into things you can't depict in a photograph, because a photograph is better at doing a realistic visual image, projection of the world on a 2D sheet.
And of course, Picasso is the famous graphic artist who depicted Don Quixote or Don Quixote, the Spanish legacy. So if we touch on the idea of the windmill and where that came from, I think we can go straight to Cervantes. So a great traveler himself, somebody that participated in the Ottoman wars, the Battle of Lepanto.
Yes, he lost his Don John of Austria dancing on a ship.
He lost his arm. He was taken hostage in Africa. He was probably bought out by people for ransom eventually, and then lived to tell the tale. I mean, very much like a Marco Polo kind of character that's probably
has seen everything, has seen different worlds.
Experience being the key. And then at the same time, there's this idea in his book of this mad man who's obsessed with French cavalier literature of chansons de Roland.
He's read, the Mallory, Morte d'Arthur, and chansons de Roland. All these fantasias in that time irrelevant to muskets and cannons and siege engines, and so he then wants to hark back to this bygone age of knights, St George tilting at the dragon.
So the windmill as a dragon is actually a satanic image, a moving image.
Dark satanic mills of Blake.
Yeah, it's a moving image, and it's very difficult to deal with. And I think one of the things that Cervantes must have done is realize that he couldn't actually come at such a thing as an ancient windmill from the perspective of one character's point of view. So he invented Sancho Panza
because he's delusional. The Don Quixote is a delusional man, so needs then the pazzo, needs the sidekick as the. Well, it's a comedy double act. It's the straight man and the funny man.
Yeah,
and
the sophisticated man and the man of the people.
And so Sancho Panza's the straight man in terms of he's commenting as the internal audience on the funny man's funny activity. And then there's
a third character, which is Dulcinea del Toboso, who is a woman who actually, unbeknown to herself, has no idea that she's being turned into a princess in the eyes of this man who's much older and probably unattractive and unfit as a husband. Then you get other characters. For example, Don Quixote and Sancho Panza ride into this tavern where they meet prostitutes, and he assumes that they're princesses and empresses.
And he's in a court.
And he treats them completely unrealistically, resulting in himself and Sancho getting beaten up and turfed out. Then sort of other episodes.
Because they're not participating in the narrative that they're actually in. They're thinking it's something
live in
grand,
a fictional world,
and wonderful. And here we go. Here's Sancho Panza.
And then the sort of other side of that, the revanche, is when on Revanche he falls into the palms of that simple man who has no sophisticated education. on a state, starts advising the empress on how to do things for the people. And because he's of the people, he's listened to and
like Casanova.
mocked.
Casanova also did this. He ran a casino at Versailles and then became advisor to the court because he seemed to be a guy that could get shit done. He was a fixer.
So anyway, so going back to the windmill, I traveled Europe. I was video cameraing in the fallen Soviet Union, in Romania, in Italy, finding all these authentic old world ways of living and dying out. Anything from people growing their own vegetables to building their own bridges and houses out of detritus.
So we're living in the detritus of a fallen
empire
state.
Yeah. And at the same time, I would present these videos inside that windmill, which didn't fit in, stuck out like a carbuncle in this huge university building, which had other departments, which would have geography next door complaining about me knocking this together. And so at the same time as this, the builders were only too happy to give to me because they wouldn't have to pay for an extra skip. So suddenly thing I had to do was invest in a drill and some screws and then put together
this carbuncle,
this house. So building a house and actually creating my own space without the university, and in a sense trying to live in the world. So by occupying a space outside the exhibition space, I was the only one in that year to embark upon dealing with realities of the world, which I was trying to bring in.
Instead of putting something on the wall in the white box that is sort of loud, you then moved out into the world
and put the
real thing. Today is garbage in, garbage out. And if you have a garbage civilization, you're going to get that reproduced over and over again in different formats.
Of course, you could buy expensive bronze and marble and make whatever installation out of thousands of pounds worth of material. Most art students wouldn't be in a financially viable position to do that, unless maybe some of them had sponsors or they inherited something. So first of all, I was collecting scrap metal from the detritus of London factories and driving around asking for anything. Stuff was thrown out. Art students walking along with a shopping trolley, stopped by police and sort of saying, "What are you doing? Are you thieving around?" No, we're art students. Oh, that's okay then. So we would bring in all this crap.
Oh, that's nice with the picture.
And then build. And so the materials in question, and behind us is this stonemasonry and glass,
beautiful Corinthian pilasters and well apportioned Palladian
ironmongery, all this kind of language of imperial endlessness in terms of persistent in time, and then at the same time the materials that we have around us today left over from building sites. So wood, metal, what are the materials that we can use? We can find furniture, we can find old trolleys, we can find barrels of oil,
Hoardings from building sites.
So hoarding is actually the word I wanted to say, because I think every artist is a collector, even Picasso, hoarder of his own things. Yes. He's collecting his own images, he's collecting his own drawings, he's brainstorming. And so we were in seminars discussing what to do. And of course, there was this dead silence most of the time where people just didn't know what to say. They're very much afraid of the postmodern problem that overrides any legitimacy of any act.
Well, it's interesting. There are two kinds of artists. And we were looking at this the other day with regard to the organ donorship, of whether you can will your possessions to be destroyed on your death. So there are two kinds of artists. There's the kind of artist where they want to have all their papers and drafts and sketches and so on destroyed, so people only concentrate on the finished works, whether it's literary works or whether it's architectural works or whether it's pictures. Or on the other hand, they want to keep the archive. They want to keep all of the stuff of life. They are a hoarder, and so you can see the working. It's like the difference between presenting the answer in a maths problem and showing all of your working along the way. So can people replicate it? Can it be used as part of a discourse, or is it just this man did this thing and now he's gone and the thing is just there as a monument?
So the concept of this clash between
then you have the executors who can sometimes do the opposite of what the person wants. So they can either keep the things that they want to destroy because they think they're beautiful, or they can destroy the things like the erotic art or the love letters and so on because they think it's unseemly
or shameful.
Yes.
So you're looking at a windmill in a university. But just shortly before doing this project, I had visited Berlin, I was lucky enough, because my parents had a concert there, and we were visiting Potsdam.
Yes.
So Friedrich II built a large collection,
German Versailles,
of palaces. Yeah, very much emulating Louis and Versailles. And he took land outside Berlin, in Brandenburg, which was very much bovine setting of people farming and milling. And so this ancient windmill stood on the hill at the top of now a sort of cascade.
If you search for windmill Potsdam, you might find it.
And in this scenario of looking at the high baroque of
Sanssouci, and
you're suddenly struck with a wooden mill that doesn't seem to be in the right context.
Scenario.
So there were songs written about the miller who told Friedrich to stuff it, and he's not moving, and he's not letting them demolish his windmill.
So he was like in Las Vegas when the little old man with the up house from Pixar says, "No, I'm holding out on my ground. I won't accept your 1 million."
There we are.
So there's Sanssouci.
We've got vines and sort of gardening, and then you've got this thing.
Bloody great windmill.
Which is a hellish image, of course, used by Bosch and others,
and then Blake's Dark Satanic Mills, who all the Luddites are against mechanical reproduction.
It's not for polite people. It's just a place.
So this was the holdout. This was what remained once the king tried to take control.
And the other reference was the Miller's Tale. The Miller's Tale.
Oh yes.
In Chaucer, sort of the demonic things that go on behind the scenes. Yeah. So the Miller in Potsdam won the court case. There were songs written about him, and there was a decree of some sort of legislation that stopped that mill from ever being
he had a right, yes.
And Frederick, who has been rather well known for his military successes and his
Prussian
character,
Junker class,
with his son, and all these other stories of rebellion.
So Immanuel Kant created his system of ethics because he saw the Junker class, the military class of Prussia, hunting peasants. And he said, we need to create a system of morality and ethics and law, which doesn't allow these rich men to go on peasant hunts and hunt them with dogs across the fields. But this was what Prussia was about. It was about this military dictatorship.
But as art students, we were the peasants occupying this kind of architecture. We were in a Baroque frame, but essentially with these uncouth, covered in paint splashes, young generation of freedom seekers that were there for a limited time only. And of course, I made the most of it. I was working in the workshop, learning from Terry and other people like Giles and Sarita, all the technical side of melting metal and turning liquid lead into a shape, or welding things together, learning about how to do wood carpentry, construction techniques. So I didn't just waste my time, inventing my own sort of abstract nonsense in the room with tutors coming by and saying, "Oh, what are you doing?" I would very much, be not in the studio space. Most of the time I'd be somewhere else learning a new skill.
So I was at the second year show of Central St. Martin's back in 2015, and they produced kind of finger paint. It was the painting course of Central St. Martin's in Brick Lane in a white box. And this is the typical thing that you were talking about. So they were in a white box gallery, kids of 20 years old. They were creating finger paintings. They were pouring crude oil into a paddling pool. There was a commentary on global warming.
You can express yourself.
They were creating, but they were kind of creating the kind of finger paints you'd expect of a 5-year-old. And they said to me, they're crying out for training.
Probably saying no, they're very clever and they've got some very complicated, sublime idea.
Yes.
So let's think about the rubbish and postmodernism and the ideology of art today. What does it say? I mean, okay, you've got a degree show, but then presumably you get picked up by a gallery, and unless you've got something very marketable to sell on a very applied market, you're learning to draw then or something else. But they're actually, what is your ideology? What are you trying? What doctrine do you adopt? So, okay, you start with Picasso. You go into
So you've got to find your place in the Picasso reality of doing something other than realistic,
somewhere in between
realistic
Jackson
picture
Pollock
making. So Jackson Pollock was what they were doing. They were doing 5-year-olds version of Jackson Pollock. That's where they get to. And the reason,
well, I mean, that's patronizing too.
No,
but
they were crying out. They were crying out to me, saying, "Look, we don't know how to do art. We want someone to slap us on the wrist. We want somebody to beat us until we know how to draw. We want, like you were saying, go to the V&A and just draw until your hands bleed." They don't get to do that. What they get is a seminar where they have to critique one another's work.
And so they just stood there saying, "I like it though."
And the tutor then isn't allowed to give them technical.
No, because that would be touching them and infringing on their expression.
Instruction to, like, this is better than that, because they've got the relativism of saying, well, this can't be better than that. Everything is subjective.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a church. It's like all churches, all peoples, all nations. And so you go back to the idea of the British Empire having to change the program so that it doesn't exclude new cultures and outsider culture becoming the main establishment. So let's go back to America. I mean, this new art world created just after the Second World War. I mean, by the time
the CIA was investing in Jackson Pollock,
the CIA was collecting art. There were great private collectors like Walters, going over buying, all of what there was in Europe for threepence, because the American army was present in Europe, so they could take the best stuff out of museums, and including the Soviet Union, in exchange for weapons, they could eke out the best, Tintoretto or whatever, and put it in, say, Philadelphia, or Boston, and you can still see the Russian text on the frame. So basically, America had raided Europe, and then at the same time, they had a civilization which needed to include lots of different art, and of course they couldn't carry on saying that the Indians and the primitive so-called primitive civilizations were beneath them. They couldn't continue having an American Indian sitting in the museum as a live exhibit, because this was, you're falling into all sorts of trouble, political correctness, inclusion, and so you've got the classical art collected by the sort of connoisseurs of America. At the same time, you've got Warhol, and this young artist who comes along, Basquiat, who brings in a completely poetic and different approach. From having had no preparation, so the idea of starting from scratch, no art history, vis-a-vis too much art history, too much baggage, as they used to say in the Slade. You've got too much baggage. You're carrying the cross on your back.
So you were trying to create, at some level, classical work that deserved to be made.
I wasn't strictly classical. I'd had a classical training to some extent, and I continued that afterwards at the City and Guilds and other places like the Royal Drawing School. But the idea was that I was going to come up with an ideology based on my research. So I would go out into the world and find out these funny stories like the windmill, or like the Sicilian fish market, and film and photograph, document a dying world.
So you went to Romania, and Romania had been destroyed by communism, by capitalism, by the EU.
Yeah.
And so
all these Eastern
people
countries
were living in, as you were saying, the detritus of their own civilization.
Yeah, I mean, you had the older generation who were farmers and sort of screaming out how they loved Ceausescu and the collective farms. And then you've got their children and grandchildren who are basically reaching puberty and then running off to Italy to get a job in a factory or get away in some way. And so you've got the fall of the Soviet Union, you've got the fall of Rome, fall of this great civilization that ran on its own steam and effectively, ran out of money.
Yes.
That's why the Soviet Union collapsed, was that they didn't have any pecuniary backing for the voluntary labor that was involved, and people had stopped being motivated to work for the state out of obligation.
Yes.
So all these masses immigrations of people, a wave of people that I'd come over with in the 90s, of young families trying to look for a better life in a better world
of England.
And in many senses, everybody probably agrees, that America and Britain were presenting themselves as the kind of pinnacle of civilization, countries that would include and promote the work of people who had been oppressed in their respective countries, whether it be an Iraqi sculptor who wasn't approved of by Saddam, or a contemporary musician like my mother or my father did, who came over here as Anglophiles, but also as contemporary musicians that had been oppressed in their own country. So, we're bringing this civilizations and their mutation as well, because I have to note that as one of the effects of the fall of communism was the rise of orthodoxism.
So they went back again.
Well, I mean, they found orthodoxism in its own ruins, in the fire of wrecked churches. People en masse began to feel they identify with a past long forgotten, and at the same time, people found Judaism and found Islam and many other.
Well, so I have Kurdish friends in London, and they're all exiles from Iran, from Kermanshah in the west, in the mountains, and they were brought in. They were like Sunni Muslims. They were then in a place that was ruled by Shia. And so they come to London, and they either go atheist or they go Zoroastrian. They go like modern or ancient.
That's a personal choice, and it should be a personal right. And the worst thing is to discuss religion and politics. But I think what came into my work was to explore a post-Soviet space in which suddenly, the churches were blooming like orchards. On every tree there was an apple. In every town there was a new gleaming golden dome. And
so they were renovating the existing buildings that had been turned into cultural centers. What were they?
Well, they were storage museums. They were whatever it could be. They didn't essentially have a function. Often, if priests were allowed to practice in Soviet times, they were probably part of the KGB. So it wasn't a very nice idea to go and confess to a priest, because then the state would know everything about you, and woe betide. So suddenly this cultural change, what I was witnessing was sort of mass immigration of Orthodox Romanians and Bulgarians and Russians, Ukrainians coming over to London and bringing with them.
And when was this?
Well, throughout the 90s and noughties, and as I was traveling back to these countries, from growing up hearing about the Soviet past, I was suddenly faced with a completely new world, a world that had gone through the terrible banditism of the 90s and through so many upheavals, and at the same time, great confidence in the great big state of, Putinism. And Yeltsin obviously hadn't really quite got the reins of power. So this new state ideology of church and state and patriotism and patriarchy and all this kind of identity seeking vis-a-vis looking for a new identity that people really seriously adopted. I mean, older people possibly remembered.
Well, not from 1917 then.
Yes, it's tricky because some people they secretly remained Orthodox or Jewish heritage would secretly be kept in the family, but under very sort of hush. Anyway, so at the same time, I'm in this kind of multicultural metropolis, making paintings based on the videos that I was shooting of mass processions with people in incense burners and soldiers parading around with machine guns and showing the power of the church and the state. And then military parades of victory over Germany still going on.
It's just been moved to
It's been moved to July because they can't do it in the coronavirus. And then we're looking at buildings. So Stalinism and, the propaganda and readoption of
ancient
old Baroque
monuments.
Buildings with the hammer and sickle. So in the Soviet context or the Eastern European context, you would see a Palladian building as associated with communism.
Yes.
The very thing that communism had gone and destroyed was churches and Palladianism, except for when they saw fit to remodel it as a theatre or a public building.
Yes.
And sort of this rise of capitalism has kind of perpetuated the idea that you have these institutions. So if you look,
so now we're getting where we were this morning.
Society.
We were talking about your windmill as a ramshackle structure within a beautiful ancient palace. And we started using it as a metaphor for how we live today, that we live in the ramshackle stable blocks. If you look at mews houses, they're very expensive, millions of pounds in London today. They are stable blocks where horses were deemed fit to live.
Or a wharf.
Or warehouses, which were functional.
Factory
industrial factory buildings
buildings,
and places to store grain at temperatures that would make sure it wouldn't rot.
So from a society
with thick walls that would last a long
workers,
time.
factory laborers, plebs, and praetorians and military, in a divided society, to a much more transient idea.
So now all of those structures, which before had a function, either as a garage, a stable for your horses, servants' quarters, or as a functional warehouse or factory, now become more places to put box apartments.
Yeah.
And the thing is that the apartments we build now, or the buildings we build now, are so flimsy that using the functional architecture of the past is more preferable in terms of luxury than in building something fresh, which is disposable, made of concrete, steel, glass,
so you look at the materials
plastic.
of architecture today, you're looking at wood and metal, you're looking at bricks and steel, you're looking at concrete and glass. Plastic, You're not necessarily, you either have conservation or you have restoration, which are two different concepts. In that, restoration can give you a chance to edit what you have, and conservation just leaves it as is in the best form possible. You clean up the wall, but don't change anything about
you don't put a kitchen in it.
I also had a fascination with architecture because I was born in a suburb of Moscow with identical looking tower blocks. So there was nothing around except for one little church in the forest nearby that had any historic association or any aesthetic, because what I was looking at was blue and white tiles, balconies, and cars, all identical cars, by the way, which changed to, in the 90s, different cars. Yes. So from the idea of everyone having a Lada to possibly having a Western car changed, and then from living in a tower block, I suddenly was airdropped into Cambridge and London, and living, surrounded by the aesthetic pleasure of old churches and beautiful old Tudor buildings, or whatever it might be, what have you. You
Georgian plainism and so on. Yes.
And you're not necessarily, unless of course you go to Hendon or somewhere, then but
Mill Hill.
There are places that are pockets of aesthetic joy everywhere in Europe, and I think my fascination with that came. And then, obviously, my reaction to that was this kind of wooden ramshackle, because, of course, having no budget and wanting to make a statement against the institutional kind of prevalence that there was, the institution was telling us how to think, what kind of history of art we were going to employ, what ideology we could or couldn't use, and, and what the point of figurative and abstract languages was, and how to. Well, it was an open discussion, but I think my position on that was that we'd come to a point at the end of 4 years where you might have written a thesis on something. I wrote a thesis about outsider art, so I was fascinated by art that wasn't influenced by art history, and it was essentially the work of the vagrants and the mad people. So Dubuffet collecting this museum of the work of the insane, and alternative culture. And then the funding for that, which came from the CIA, and deliberately looking for a different language to Stalinism in the Cold War.
And to classicism.
Yeah, so classicism lost its kind of kudos and became a baggage to be strictly avoided, like the plague.
But also, although the rich still lived in classical structures.
Yeah, so if you look at all the dictators who've been researching Erdogan or Ceausescu, or any of these people who actually build Baroque palaces in Africa,
or Louis XIV,
they're all looking at Louis.
Frederick.
They're all looking at Baroque architecture. They're looking at historicism of pagan art through the Renaissance, and they're looking at statues of nudity, and they're looking at ideals of Greek classicism. And in the UCL quad were these two figures of athletes from the Olympus, either side of the quadrangle.
So into this classical managed space, which is a little oasis in London, which is you have the hospital going up, which is a glass plastic box, which is where you got the hoardings from,
producing all this waste as usual.
And so now you have on the Euston Road, you have the UCH hospital, which is this so-called sleek, very unsustainable glass box. And
as a building,
it
might be a brilliant hospital, but it's not there forever. It's built there.
And there's an X.
Service,
there's the X-shaped UCL building behind, which was part of the Panopticon, which was built to last and still does.
Yeah, I mean it's a cross-facing square of the colonnade on the stairs, and then you get into the library, which is obviously only for members access, and it's an immense library with vast collections of books on anything from Scandinavia to black magic. And in there are statues by Flaxman in marble, which show Grecian
UCL
neoclassical imagery of mythology, which sort of reigns supreme over all this knowledge, and it's a beautiful library. There's stucco in there.
Yes.
But what we're studying is the total opposite. We're studying the art of rebellion. So I'd go into this beautiful library to read about de Buffet, and
but they called you a rebel. They called you a rebel within their supposedly rebellious
within a free think tank. Yeah.
Yes.
So insofar as they were concerned, we were supposed to produce a thesis, produce some artwork, and then go away. So where do you go after this? You got your degree in art. You obviously can't get a job in this, and you knew that from the beginning. But you've gone in for it anyway because
it's prestigious.
You're learning and developing.
It's relatively
you're living in this metropolis.
It's relatively low cost if you got the loan obligation.
And the advantage of this university was to meet lots and lots of different people studying lots of things. It wasn't just an art school. It was an opportunity to mingle with lawyers and doctors and biologists, and who would have completely different disciplines. So I'd invite all these people in and paint their portraits. And so paint the life model and try and learn life drawing and drawing classically.
So inside the windmill, you turned it into a cinema, and you were showing the films of Romanian people failing at dealing with the post-imperial reality.
Yeah, and at the same time, the concern with skill. I mean, like people being able to build their own house and bridge, people being able to butcher a pig, and people knowing about this rather than going into Tesco's and seeing a plastic coated piece of ham and not knowing where chicken comes from. A lot of young children don't know where the meat comes from. And here you have these markets in Sicily where you got horse heads lying on the ground. I mean, it's not particularly a nice impression, but it gives you a completely...
It's Caravaggio.
You go into the reality of eating meat and fish and vegetables all in one big parade. So I was showing that. I was going back to the old skills. So like going back to the medieval windmill vis-a-vis the modern institution of rearing young sons and daughters, of the people that can apply for art school. And then at the same time, a kind of negating of skill because it wasn't really important. So what I think I was trying to show was that, yes, you could learn the skills, be it ramshackled or not, to quickly put together a tower, a house, a cinema, to quickly, knock together film editing, sculpture, performance art, ideology, heraldry, everything.
What are you telling me what was on the door?
Well, the hoardings have diagonal sort of bend sinister.
Like flesh, yes.
Which really, even for an animal, they're flashing because they're luminous paint and they're showing you diagonal lines and something off balance. So really like to avoid because, the big dumpster is going to come over. And so it's a building site. And at the same time, there was this red door where I drew a bunny rabbit instead of a double-headed eagle. So
you can see the double-headed eagles on some of the flags.
Yeah, because I had these prints of some event I was doing decorations for with which were recycled. Yes. Yeah. So there's this imperial Roman imagery in a Roman building. And heraldic diagonal bends, obviously attracting attention. But also this windmill that was defunct. It didn't actually mill anything. It was just a capsule of life after the Slade, as they said. So what did that lead to? Well, I'd been constructing it out of wood and finally fell asleep in there one night and actually spent the night.
Yes, and then you realised that you could.
Yeah,
and then nobody threw you out, so you suddenly get in the territory. And then
suddenly I had become a feature of the university as part of the university for one night. And until they knocked down this building, which I then actually gave all the materials to somebody else to recycle.
Didn't need to dispose of it yourself.
So
again, like the people that gave it to you. Yes, it's garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah.
You create it out of the other people's garbage. Then once it has to come down, you give it on to the next.
Yeah, and there were, the door frame
student.
was oak wooden architrave from one of the offices in the prestigious university that had been thrown out in the skip, and there was a chair there that you can see sort of a chaise longue, probably from a surgical operating table or a Freudian couch where your dreams
are
become reality, whatever.
Yes.
And statues inside and out, bits of wood. Also, actually, I stuck plates up in the corner there. You can see, like in a traditional folk restaurant.
Yes.
I stuck these paint-covered plops of paint, on dishes. So the idea of tradition.
But this isn't thumbing your nose at tradition in the way that the people inside this institution were trying to do. Much as they were located inside this classical building, they were trying to distance themselves from the ambitions of classicism by doing this rebellious sort of post-war ideology. And then by creating something that to them, although they were meant to be rebels, seemed like this quixotic rebellion, and including these elements of function which they dislike, including these elements
and the practical skills
of looking back to
building
the past,
a gable,
which they don't like.
Yeah, I mean, I was assisting people on putting a raw plug and a screw into the wall to hang their final degree piece in the master's degree, because they were students who'd spent 3 years without learning how to put a roll plug in the wall or hang a picture. So they're doing a degree in painting,
but they don't know how you get it from a flat or onto the wall itself.
This is the kind of generation that would buy it all on eBay. They would buy. You might as well get someone to paint your work.
Well, now you can. With Amazon, you can not only get the thing, you can get the installation of the thing.
Yeah.
As part of that process.
So you come out of an institution, and where do you go next? And I went on to study again, but in the interim, there was a problem of earning money and obviously existing in this huge city, and one thing led to another, and suddenly I ended up at a squat party. I was introduced to a few squatters by Joshua Nico, who's a journalist friend of mine. And, I soon ended up, after a holiday in Greece, sort of learning to do bronze casting on a Greek island. I suddenly whooshed into the Mexican Embassy, Hertford Street.
Yes.
So this chap, Dan Simon, who actually occupied professionally until being evicted, buildings of the highest architectural order, which were abandoned. So suddenly we became aware of a long list, which was produced by Mark Gard, of 100,000 properties in the UK which were not being used, and often owned by offshore people who actually couldn't afford to go to the courts or pay their taxes or sell their property. And so they had this capital sitting and rotting there, reducing the value of other properties adjacent. And that's another one actually just around the corner. That was the Reader's Digest building, which again, office of about 7 stories, where we had an exhibition and theatre shows. So we would then create a free space, not outside, but inside.
Yes.
Empty, unwanted buildings there until we would be evicted. And so by the time we were evicted each time, we'd have a new one.
But you couldn't build a long-term infrastructure.
So somebody had to break in. And of course, this is where you get into the dodgy area of criminal breaking and entering, which I didn't really have too much to do with, because there was a team of people who would go in and say they found a window open. And I mean, this was shocking. I mean, how can you say to someone, I broke into your house because your window was open? But that's what was going on on a very, very large scale. And there was residential properties, there were factories, there were big raves in buildings. There was Paris, which we also occupied. This is actually on Leicester Square, an old block of flats that, just due to the death of one occupant who'd rotted in his own flat, had been emptied out. So there we are, stood with Hubert, who's a wonderful artist who actually, unfortunately, is no longer alive. But he unfortunately had a stroke, but he was absolutely young, fit and healthy. And then Dan Simon, the guy with a little bit less hair by the street sign there.
Yes.
And Pablo.
We know Pat.
Pablo, who was a German artist, performance artist that was well known for going to China and sort of ridiculing the terracotta army. And then there was these two young girls from Brazil, Thais and Talita, who were absolute party animals, and sort of tattoos, posing naked for life drawing classes that we arranged, participating in food collection in Soho on a set of rickshaws that Hubert was running.
Yeah.
So suddenly we had this whole
team of live hoarders. So you took the kind of almost squatting in your windmill in the UCL square, which was creating value, creating function out of
and not
detritus.
Necessarily money value. It was just cultural value.
Yeah. And then you moved that. You were able to move that into these disused, abandoned buildings, which were being neglected by their. Yeah,
I mean, it was the alchemy of going from pigs to fat to dripping to the iron to the, forging swords to chopping wood with them to going back around in this long circle of.
So you're creating a viable economy.
The world, and you live in the world by actually understanding how it works. So if you didn't want to go and get a job and be just like everybody else, 9 to 5, pay your rent. Obviously, there was this alternative avenue, and of course, it paved with danger and exciting adventure, climbing on roofs, dealing with bailiffs, throwing out homeless people with any means necessary, and creating a space for people without having to pay rent for spaces, like actors and musicians, and painting, and art, and then creating food out of thrown away food that had been in, sushi and pret-a-manger, just to say the least. We made a movie with ITV later about how much food waste was going in the bin, 100 million tons in the UK in 2010 or something. And, all this just absolutely outrageous waste.
So you can then eke out this existence, creating value out of the detritus of other people.
Yeah, but we were all kind of lost parts.
But we as a society, what I wanted to bring this discussion around to is we as a society are doing this on a grander scale. We just delude ourselves about it. So we build these plastic boxes and live in them, and a few of us get to live in the stable blocks, and a very few of us get to live in the Georgian actual architecture that's not a stable block, that's the actual house.
Billionaire.
And so we have this hierarchy of living. We're all living in the detritus of a prior civilization. What I looked at, which I gave you as an example, I think is a good one, is if you leave a cathedral, barring an earthquake, it'll be there. You can neglect it for quite a while. It'll still be standing.
Proper stonemasonry.
Whereas if you take a time lapse video of the mayoral assembly, London Assembly building on the South Bank, and you take a time lapse video that you can see a gantry moving around with guys, the workers on it,
the Mayor of London
repairing the structure around and around. And
windmill of disgust.
Yes, the windmill of maintenance. Yeah. And so if they're not doing this, if they're not keeping the glass so it doesn't pop out with the different coefficients of heating and cooling between the plastic and the glass and the steel of these diamond-shaped,
like bicycle maintenance.
These diamond-shaped windows, then the building actually falls to pieces, probably within a month of neglect, rather than within maybe hundreds of years of neglect. If you take really old structures that have been abandoned and still stand.
One of my colleagues was painting Trafalgar Square overgrown as a jungle for his degree piece at the Camberwell Arts College. I got to exhibit in the City of Mayor of London building with my scrap metal sculptures, thanks to the Russians who'd paid lots and lots of money to do a Maslenitsa festival there. Was
this Boris Johnson's time?
It was just at the beginning of Boris Johnson. I was living and working in a studio down in Tooley Street or something like that, just in London Bridge, and Druid Street. There was this massive complex where I would make statues and continue.
Oh, yes, we went there. Yes.
Which was owned by Russell, the man who had a tank.
And Russian army Humvees and.
Yeah, I mean, he had a team of Russian heavy military guys living in sea containers. Yes. Which is very similar to the windmill. Coming out in the morning to build sort of Ganesh statued temples for meditation, and he had a Japanese wife, and he was a very interesting landlord, I have to say. Obviously, he was very kind to provide such a building for artists to paint in. which is an old factory, and suddenly I came across the road with these sack trolleys and statues right into the Mayor of London. All security like, what's going on? We got this crazy group of
this is Artemis
people, with scrap metal statues turning up at the Mayor. On 9th floor, please.
Which we've now exhibited in Mayfair.
And under the veil of the Russian, I don't understand. I suddenly occupied London's Mayor of London administration. Norman Foster.
Yes.
Up yours.
Yes, the motorcycle helmet.
Yeah.
Which is totally non-sustainable.
Yeah.
Because it falls down if you don't
and
look
as
after
I was
it.
cycling, which is another point, a very major part of this operation is cycling and not paying money for public transport, not going on the tube, not getting involved, not being filmed, going around on a bicycle and crossing social barriers.
Yes.
And
you can really feel it when you become a cyclist.
Yeah, you suddenly go from A to B. You cross from a slum to a millionaire's office in 5 minutes. And
you don't need to pay money in the Oyster. You don't.
And you're flying, so nobody can stop you. Nobody sees you there. You're just like you're like a camera or a drone on your own wheels,
moving through the space.
So
cutting through the boundaries.
Yeah, we were cycling into this new world without really existing. It's like what I would call like watching the television. Like moving around and looking at buildings, looking at how London changed. And of course, London was changing how? You go through this central part of the city, and you would see every year a new skyscraper, like a mushroom.
Yes.
And the Shard eventually growing over that. And so it transformed within, from say 2004 to 2020 now, where we have, still unfinished scaffolding of new structures.
Yes.
That have just
in the city of London, on Bishopsgate and around there.
Completely overhanging, like the walkie-talkie, which actually did set fire to its next door neighbour by projecting light into the front of the shop.
Refracting.
Apparently.
It was a supercar. It was like a Ferrari or something.
Yeah.
It fried a Ferrari.
Got beamed because it was under this architecture, this very oppressive
glass
architecture. Nothing to do with London's history, really.
No, there were these. There's the beautiful map of London, the beautiful 1805 map of London, which we can actually find. Panorama. It's a panorama map of London about 1805 or 1810. It was like Napoleonic period, and right behind you can find a big panorama, and right behind the Tower of London, where all that glass is now, these beautiful circus Georgian squares, capsule circuses inside.
Oh well, that's behind Liverpool Street.
No, there were more. There was a whole district of them, which have been
they had to make way. Obviously, the Blitz made way for 150 Wren churches that were burnt down.
Yeah. So if you look up panorama map London like 1810, and there should be. It's like a oblique. It's like an oblique.
Well, like you get these views
overview
from Greenwich, where you see the panorama of London, which of course now is obscured by the Shard. But what you would see first was Southwark Cathedral, and then you would see, the sort of spires of London behind it. But what I'm getting at is that through cycling through the city, I was constantly exposed to empty streets of Baroque.
It's called the Rhinebeck panorama.
With
Nelson's London.
Maritime carvings showing the sea supremacy on the buildings of a maritime empire that ceased to exist, and then on the top of that you've got the reflection of these buildings in glass facades that are these giant towers that you were saying that contain entire armies of people.
Yes, so you walk through the city of London and you see these giant towers above you, and they contain an army of 10,000 strong. And if you had an army in the days of the East India Company, a private army of that scale, you could be here we go. Maybe that's Rhinebeck panorama.
Well, there's nothing taller than St. Paul's, basically, right?
So St. Paul's is the
acme,
the centerpiece of the whole thing. And so this is, you can see, this is one of the Rhinebeck panoramas. Okay, this is another one. I've got it here. So, so you can see
an
now
army of people.
These army of people in a tower who, in the age of the East India Company, would be out conquering territory, would be out annexing annexing places in the world to bring into their empire.
Building ports, building ships.
Building industry and so on. Now that army of 10,000 people is inside that tower, and they're creating financialized transactions, which then take the place in the virtual sphere of money making. From actually doing anything in the world. You can see it on an individual basis with video games. You know, I'm an emperor of Rome.
You're going to the gym and paying to move and
my empire is contained within a kilobyte of data in a virtual machine. And so instead of building an empire in the world, you got all these men inside their basements creating video game empires and then deleting them and then starting them again.
Yeah. Or people in the office in the Matrix going to work, going to the gym instead of having exercise, watching pornography instead of having sex, going as tourists to different countries and spending their money instead of actually going to do something useful
and build something for themselves.
And then sort of a small army that doesn't really, that just does what the American army does in different countries, but essentially a civilization where the function and the skills of the carpenter or the butcher and the baker and the candlestick maker is no longer needed, because you've got this other countries like China producing everything for us. Or,
yes.
Stone and metal work going on in India at such a low price that the idea of made in England, or the idea of Rolls-Royce made in England or something like this is almost it exists. You've got the yachts and the fancy cars still being produced bespoke for export, but they're for millionaires. There's no middle ground of manufacturing going on, which means that artists are basically having to disregard their skills. I mean, you can't do that with music because musicians still have to play their instrument, but with
although they can do it through a video phone now, as we
yes and no. But what I'm saying is that the training involved in the fine artist is purely ideological, and the ideology is that you end up in the garbage can with the rest of the rubbish.
Garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah, so you're just a piece of human garbage that goes in and out, and you don't necessarily have any career prospects except for maybe teaching or doing something.
So here we go.
Really fulfilling your potential.
This is a high-res Rhinebeck panorama, and if we zoom in to St. Paul's, you can see here on the about the center here is St. Paul's, and that's the tallest structure in London. The other skyline is made up of Wren's city churches
and Hawksmoor
and Vanbrugh. So this is taken in from an aeronautical perspective in like 1810 or so. This is
totally invented because they couldn't, or did they have?
They had a balloon.
A hot air balloon.
They had a balloon apparently. So they went up, and they either provide a fictive version or they just observed. 1806. Here we go. No, sorry, that's we're not. That's not. Anyway, so if we find the Tower of London, so if you scroll across there, the Tower of London, I think it's below us now.
No, it's not.
It is.
Right.
It's
it's the wrong way around.
So you can see.
How's this possible?
You can see parades.
Is this a mirror image?
Yeah, we're seeing it the other way around.
Oh, okay.
They're seeing it the right way around. So we can see then like parades. If you zoom in a bit, military parades going round the squares, and if you go above, slightly up from there, you can see these amazing sort of architecture that's all been leveled to produce the city of London. And so this is
and you still see the back of a couple of Georgian houses.
So if you on the edge of the screen that's just come into the screen, here's a beautiful little capsule circus, Georgian circuses.
Oh right, yeah.
Look, they're going all the way back. They got this estate of Georgian circuses, it capsuled inside the estate.
Mm-hmm.
They're really wonderful buildings that were going up through the 18th century. And you can see this if you zoom out to the whole panorama, you can see there's a military parade going around the square. And you see the whole panorama. So here's the Port of London, which goes up before Tower Bridge, goes up as it is built about a century, well, sort of 75 years on from here. You can see the Port of London flows right up into the city itself, and so you have the exchange.
The ships would be able to go in
of grain and various products on the wharves of London, which have now all been demolished. Also, where the Sea Containers Hotel kind of area is now, that's where all of these guild halls directly interface. Yes, Fishmongers Guild directly interfaces with the ships coming in, the products that they're then processing in the industry of London, and so then we have this functioning metropolis where the real industry is inside the city.
Well, I mean,
itself.
you've got Chatham Docks, you've got down towards Dartford, all these.
But also, you have really beautifully laid out
Greenwich.
City in terms of the classical architecture, in terms of.
Well, and of course, New York looked like that as well about that time. You've got the Customs House, New York, and the old Palladian buildings, some of which are still left in amongst the New York Manhattan skyline.
So what you see here is that the fire of London ravages medieval London, the city of London, this side in front of us, and then we have that's the south of the river, and you can see all the warehouses, which some people still now are turned into apartments. So if you go to the north, if you go to the other side, the north side, this is the side that's then Wren has taken. Here we go. Wren has taken this and made a kind of rationalized city plan after the Great Fire of London in 1666.
But looking at this now, it's as if you're standing on the walkie-talkie on the precipice, having a drink in the bar with your palm tree next to you, and you're just looking almost like from an airplane.
This is like the Shard. This is like where the Shard is now.
Exactly. And what does that say? I mean, we've reached the heavens in terms of looking over a panoramic view. And I'd go up to the Shard when I was living there nearby and just go and do watercolors of Southwark Cathedral as this former towering over London thing.
Yes, which is now a tiny little gnome. Yes,
and think, well, is this it? Is this the big metropolis? Is this
is this the best that civilization can offer? Yeah. And again, it's that glass and steel spike. I mean, firstly, it's a great big middle finger by
Renzo Piano,
by both Renzo Piano and by then the Emirati types who have built it south of the river. They left it empty for many years because they wanted city rents for the units, and so instead of lowering the rent, because actually it's in Southwark, it's not in the city of London, the idea of the owners was that the property prices should be the same on the south side of the river, and that they were feasible, and that they were going to wait until somebody's willing to be able to pay that.
They wrecked all the businesses around because they closed down these shunt and other buildings that had been under the railway line to now make way for the station, but also to make way for generators for the car park inside.
We had a very nice New Year's party with Jimmy Wales in Shunt back in 2010.
Well, there you go. So the whole area changed. Some businesses, Russell stood up to them and said, "We're not knocking down this old building here to make way for your."
Oh yes, the yard.
I was in there at the time, but my point is that the cities with European history are adopting the idea of the Tower of Mordor.
Yes.
Stood as a needle.
A big middle finger.
Yeah. And the other city that I was struck by was St. Petersburg, which has done exactly the same thing. The Lachta Center, Lahta, which is, they disputed for a long time where that was going to be put because they dug up the land around it and found a medieval Viking village had been sort of in the clay. So they moved the Lachta Tower further out of St. Petersburg into the Primorsky Rayon.
And primeval region.
No, by the sea.
Is that built now?
Yeah. So recently driving around St. Petersburg in the last few years.
Is that near Kronstadt or where is that?
Well, it's on the road facing the city. And if you continue down that road to Sestroretsk direction, you will get onto the Kat motorway, which will go on to Kronstadt and then round to the base of the Gulf of Finland, where you would, go past the Russian palaces like Peterhof.
Yeah.
So it is the needle of
Eye of Sauron.
It is the Eye of Sauron, but it's also the only thing
now
that you can, you can orienteer your direction.
It's like in Berlin and London, the Telegraph Tower.
Yes.
50 years later version of that.
Yes, it is. Yes.
It's not having a forest of skyscrapers like Manhattan, but it's having
Bologna.
The one skyscraper.
Yeah.
Not interfering with the classicism of the Rastrelli or whatever.
Yes.
But it's somehow, this is Gazprom and whoever, Russian Neft, all these Russian millionaires, billionaires, building a statement of a flame of gas. So that's supposed to be like a lighter.
Okay. Like the Burj Dubai.
So not glass shard.
Yes, it is like burning off the oil.
Yeah.
From the oil rig. Yes. From the derrick.
The never-ending pressure of Russian, gas.
But they've got it
oil.
with the Burj Dubai and so on in
Burj Al Khalifa.
Yes.
So that's the tallest building in the world or something until I don't
kilometer
know,
high.
probably,
Yeah.
But
these things will fall down. These will not last for. They're not pyramids. They're not cathedrals.
To be maintained.
They're meant. They need this constant maintenance. So
used by incredibly rich people as offices.
Much like who is it? Mark Quinn. I think the work of art, the work of conceptual art that I've most been interested in is Mark Quinn's head of his own blood. It's in the National Portrait Gallery. You can have a look. Now, I think this, like your windmill, was a good commentary on the transience of modern society. Like, if you're going to go with a conceptual notion of this performance, it's interesting. It melted, so it's as frozen. It's in a fridge, and it's like a death mask. So like Napoleon's death mask or Blake, there was a period of history when you'd put plaster on, create a mask of the face in the moment of death, the soon after. So you could show the world this person had died by showing their death mask around, showing the body.
Napoleon's death mask, or
yes, Blake,
not necessarily
Napoleon.
Mark Quinn.
So Mark Quinn is alive and made his own death mask like portrait head out of his own transfused blood. Of course, that blood is liquid at room temperature, so he needs to then put it in a fridge. So that's
the same thing as the Damien
box. Hirst so that box is a fridge. So Damien Hirst, I think, did it in an uninteresting way, but we will talk about the factory idea in a minute. But this is interesting because it melted, and then he needed to do it again.
Well, he had the mold, right?
Yeah, so he had to start fresh, but he then had to. He realized that in the National Portrait Gallery, it needs its own generator. It's like a hospital, right? Yeah. It needs its own generator. So if the power goes out, then it can still not be ruined because of the building power going down. So the fuses blow.
It's got its own.
It's got its own separate generator. So I thought this was interesting in terms of our fossil fuel unsustainable society, because it shows that the art doesn't have any staying power beyond the motor of the generator.
It depends
fully upon the sustained level of civilization you've got to, that you could have a head made
of blood. Like a given. I mean, you can't live without your batteries in your phone anymore.
Yeah, the battery is the annoying thing about the phone, because it always goes down.
Yeah.
And you're attached to a plug or to a battery pack or to a wall. But what's interesting here is that I think
at the same time,
the classical commentary
was making marble copies of his head in Italy, in Carrara. When I went to train in Italy, I found a whole workshop of Mark Quinn heads
doing his own head,
being carved in stone. And
so he's creating the monumental version.
Yeah.
And then
and this is exactly what the Buffet did, because the Buffet collected out
that's interesting.
Seawater.
So he does have the concept
washed up on the shore.
So he does have the concept of monumentality, which he's doing with the marble head. He wants the history to see what he's done, but he's also then got the one in the National Portrait Gallery. This is more. He's a very clever man.
Spinning that.
Yes, this is very nice as a two hearts, because he's trying to participate in the transience, and he's trying to present in the transience with the performance art version
at the same time,
and then do the monumentality version of Ozymandias.
Well, if you look at the Buffet, he went from making art from sort of sea clutter from the beach to actually commission giant epoxy resin and concrete statues in Chicago. So again, when he actually had to monetize. And this is what happened with Damien Hirst. He was selling the butterfly pictures and things because you can't sell cows in fridges very often.
Yes, and also that again had this notion of he was laughing all the way to the bank. His performance art is the ability of his ability to make something that's rotting, that's obviously like taxidermy is a dry art. Literally, you've got to dry out the carcass and then it's preserved.
The Egyptians preserved it for a long time.
Like the frogs doing fencing and so on, or the squirrels, in whatever. You had this dry art of taxidermy. And so you've got to desiccate the body, replace the innards with stuffing, so you get the skin back in the shape it needs to go, and then you completely dry it out, and then you can preserve it.
But then he had the
wet version where he didn't know how to do. He didn't know how to do sharks. Yeah. He didn't know how to preserve them. He just thought, shove them with formaldehyde.
Yeah.
And it's like a botched job. He doesn't do the vitrine. He doesn't do the shark. He doesn't do the formaldehyde. He doesn't do any aspect of it. He just creates the
museum of
rebus.
Himself. Yeah.
Yes, this visual pun. Oh, it's toothless, but it's got teeth. Literally, it's literally dead, but it's still dangerous.
Watch out, it might bite you. Yeah.
And so here's like taxidermy that works. This is like two frogs doing fencing, and so this is what I would call a dry art. It's literally dry, but it's also hard to do. It's like you've got to take all the innards out, you've got to replace them with stuffing, and then you put them in the pose, and you have this little sculpture, but of real frogs. But with the Damien Hirst sharks and sheep and cows, he then makes them out of a fake medium that's rotting, and so he then sold. He sold the shark, the original shark, to a consortium which included him and his gallerist.
Yeah,
so he kind of bought it from himself in this financialized scheme.
So the Goldsmith
and then
generation,
it rotted. And then he had then the buyer, which is him and the collective and the funders who've upped the price with this fake sale, had to then recreate the shark again because it rotted in slurry in the tank. So
then you're going down to the seaside, collecting sharks by the ton and fishing for them, and then selling them again. And actually, the funny story with Damien Hirst is that he bought a Palladian mansion with the money.
Yes.
And then that was full of dry rot, and he tried to donate it to the nation because he couldn't afford to pay for the conservation or restoration of this listed building.
Well, we were in the village of...
I don't know if we could find this place. Somewhere in Wales, right?
There was this one?
This is trying to give...
Toddington Manor.
Yeah, give it to the
Toddington Manor.
Because nobody could afford to pay for it. Which was kind of like us squatting a house of such a type.
So he didn't have the skill or even the money
or the knowledge that it was rotten. Did him over,
to do it up or preserve it in any way. And so he likes the aesthetic. Oh, it's like Parliament. It looks like.
Oh, really?
Yes, it looks like. It's like a mini Hawksmoor
Is it Charles Barry or
Gothic with a K Parliament? Here we go, Toddington Manor. So he's got this copy that he of Parliament Gothic, early 19th century style.
So Willow Winston just answered saying my windmill was better than Barlow. Well, I mean, let's talk about Philida Barlow.
Oh yes. Oh, so let's
Professor at the Royal Academy.
So she was the judge, she was jury, executioner of your windmill.
And then later Venice Biennale, representative of Great Britain.
Yeah, this was absolutely shameful. This was a discredit to our nation. I'm going to find this for you.
Just after Tracy Emin.
Just Google, Ollie. Just Google Philida Barlow
with
Venice.
a PHY.
Yeah. In fact, I can send you the link on Google Image and just bring up the image page. I'll just send it to you here. Yeah, I've just sent you the link of the Google Image page on the WhatsApp. This was absolutely made me stricken with disgust.
Did you go to the Venice Biennale?
No, I saw pictures.
I went there.
I saw pictures, and it shocked me because this is the archetype.
It was a barbaric up yours to the history of the arts.
This is the
which
archetype.
Is very brave of her, of course.
It's not brave. It
in a
shows.
Sense, I understand
if you go back to the gallery page of the Google, here we go, the Google Images, you can see her detritus, not in a Philip's sense of functional art, but this is just detritus inside the Palazzi of Venice, which is meant to be, it was 16th century joy of Baroque.
Well, not
majesty.
quite. I mean, that's a British pavilion built by.
There were some. There were
pavilions in the Arsenale that were built 100 years ago. Like
shit. Like
cancerous
that's all
growth.
Our society produces is tumors in palaces.
Well, so Philida is, she background. Also, she had her
and this
son,
is
Eddie.
what our nation is for.
Her son Eddie was
it makes me angry just looking at it.
Well, I mean, okay, that's good. You've got a reaction.
Let's break it down. But she's now representing me. I don't want
working for her, including some of my colleagues from studying at Slade. He was studying at the Slade. He made a dance floor as his degree piece, and he ended up doing lots of different performance art. Phillida was a head of sculpture, and we had an opportunity once to have a seminar together, or like a tutorial, where she came and sat in front of my sculptures with me. And at the time, I was kind of making wooden sculptures out of scrap and trying to come up with some figurative images.
Yes.
So again, like, what were the images saying? And so here she was telling me then an interesting question as to what are you going to do? Because if you're going to do a figurative sculpture, then you should probably consider that the ancient Greeks already did everything that was possible to do with a Greek sculpture.
Okay.
As in the hermaphrodite.
So there's nothing left.
If you look at the hermaphrodite in the Louvre, it's a statue of a female body that you approach from a side, and then as you look over, peering with your fetishizing gaze onto her breasts, you're suddenly faced with a penis, and so you realize this is both a man and a woman at the same time. So
like the Baphomet.
Yeah, so Baphomet is the next theme we're going to go into, because I think what we're looking at is a Masonic culture. So that's the back. And it does actually achieve everything that you could possibly want from a sculpture. There's a bed, there's a beautiful woman, half naked or almost naked. You've got beautiful drapery, Chesterfield furniture, very modern.
Yes,
and then you've got this beautiful portrait of the carving of hair and a cock. So what more could you possibly do? That fits the bill. And what's the point of coming up with anything further than this? I mean, what else are you going to do? Add a unicorn on there? Which lots of artists have attempted in mannerism and such.
If you look up chapel Naples, Baroque chapel sculpture Naples, then this is the next level of ability.
So she'd come from a point of view,
in my view, in terms of antiquitech, in terms of like the pure technique. What's it called? Not San Savino Chapel, Baroque sculpture chapel Naples. What's it called?
I don't know, but what I'm trying to say about Phillida is that she did pose a very interesting question, and I think that's why her practice was not about teaching people to make figurative representations, but it was to look for new ideas in a world of detritus that we are constantly attacked by. Sort of as soon as you open the door, rubbish would flow in through the deluge of rubbish, and so people would be getting expanding foam and chicken wire and sticking bits of wood together. And I thought that her son Eddie's response was quite good, because he made a dance floor which wasn't occupying space other than the squares on the floor. He wasn't actually bringing in too much rubbish into this room. There were lovely people there, but they were basically not allowed or not encouraged to make statues or any sort of figurative representation. They were making things that then led to them working for Phillida Barlow in the installations and studying at the Royal College
in Venice.
Yeah, and she had this kind of sculpture
splurging,
in
like
Burlington House as well.
Vomiting all over the place.
So the Royal Academy showcased her work, I think 2 years ago, and it was interesting to see a woman who had achieved so much without actually physically doing her sculpture, because she wasn't physically able to construct these giant towers. It required a team of builders and logistics.
Heavies, yeah.
It was a massive enterprise to take on.
So it's like creating tumors without the ability to do so, commissioning the tumor. I want to go and desecrate that place.
You can rant on about how awful it was, but in a sense, it's the same thing as my windmill. It's a big fat problem that is being discussed as a big fat problem, and then it's actually being presented in these Palladian courtyards in Venice Biennale. This thing that nobody wants to particularly pay attention to. If it was there as hoarding, it would only be there temporarily, which would negate its kind of.
So if you go to that link,
it's not going to be part of the building. It's just there. Meantime,
here we go. So this is then
the net. Yeah,
this is the San Severo Chapel in Naples.
San Severo,
and then this is probably the most accomplished carving in. Well, we don't even know how this could be made from inside and behind this net. So this is a sculpture is it James with the net as fisher of men?
Well, it could be St. Peter. It could be.
Nevertheless, what is achieved here is a sculpture composition, but then over the top of it is this marble net. And this is carved out of the same block, supposedly.
Absolutely.
As it's not placed over the top of the sculpture when finished. And this is carved without a single mistake.
The reason is they had a pointing machine. It's like, for those that don't know, that looks impossible, like the fabric on the face things.
Yes, which you can also see in this chapel. If you scroll to the next couple of images across,
you'll get to a face covered in rippling
the woman lying down here. The woman lying down in the middle.
So a technical miracle.
That will do it. Any
Bernini-esque technical miracle. Or is that the chapel of?
This is the San Severo chapel with all of these things featured in it.
Because there's another one in Naples with a sort of veiled Christ.
There is the center of this, the centerpiece of the lying down. If you find an image of the person lying down here on the tomb, that's Christ with the veil over the face from the side. The upper there, that one.
Now, also, Phillida came from a family with Mervyn Peake and Charles Darwin. She had this really great heritage.
So here we go. So if you zoom in on you can see the fish, you can see the netting in the background, but here is the veil over the face.
So much like the hermaphrodite, you're faced with a bed and somebody who's unconscious or asleep.
Or dead,
covered in muslin, which could be a funerary.
Christ
but you're essentially a voyeur moving around this unresponding. Much like most figurative paintings of women objectifying women as
the male
objects.
Gaze.
The male gaze. Yes, thanks very much to our friend from Flitwick.
Yes.
The point is that you're looking without being looked back at. You're not getting the Giorgione or
Caravaggio's looking back into the face.
You're not being there's no face-to-face sort of
encounter out of the painting.
Yeah,
back
it's not
at you.
assertive. It's you being the viewer and looking at some fabric on a figure. Now, the way to achieve that would be simply to model a clay figure to the best of your technical knowledge, and then take the measurements for the high points, take the calipers, and against the axes of X, Y, Z. On the block, when you're carving, you go up to these points, and then you can put the muslin exactly on top of this clay figure, and then just literally measure to the high points of that.
Yes.
So you're measuring two sets of data, the high points of the figure and the high points of the folds of some of the drapery, and then you're just using the pointing machine to carve to the right depth, without thinking or envisaging the image like a free carver.
In advance.
You're just literally going up to a coordinates.
You've created the clay model. You then lay actual wet cloth over the
For
clay
example,
model.
why bother actually modeling it when you can just put real cloth? And this is why it has such verisimilitude in there, because its execution is actually perfectly copied from a set of coordinates from nature. And this is where nature and photography meet impressionist carving and sculpture in the late 19th century as well, with sculptors.
If you scroll along a bit, Ollie, there are a couple more of these. You can get more of a sense of this chapel here. That's well lit.
Something incredibly real, like Carpeaux.
So this is, if you zoom a bit, so this is the whole thing. So you can see the Christ under the shroud in the center, but they're flooded with light, and every surface is full of this astonishing.
Well, I mean, Naples is you go to Naples, you die. That's the pinnacle of aesthetic experience. I mean, I was obsessed by Naples actually. In particular, as a student, I went there quite a lot because I was lucky enough to meet Domenico, who was studying in London and then went back to Naples. And so as a guest in Naples, I was able to stay at his flat and then go off after these wonderful meals to see wonderful things like Capodimonte Museum. And if we actually look for Cristo Velato, the Veiled Christ in Naples, it's one of these, treasure chests that you stumble upon in the vicoli, the little alleyways of this città sotto Vesuvio, the city constantly under threat of eruption. And therefore, actually, what I found particularly fascinating was how the citizens of Naples had occupied and squatted the finest buildings in the center of town because the rich had left. They could afford to get a boat out of the Bay of Amalfi because the rest of them would die under the eruption.
Yes.
That's another example of a lying figure, exactly like the one that you were just showing us. What was that called?
That was the San Severo Chapel.
Right, yeah. So
in Naples. And
absolutely virtuosic sculpture had been achieved as early as the 18th century, and then well into the revival, in Grimthorpe in St Albans Abbey, where we live, this figure that looks more real than life itself, in marble, lying down in his own tomb. So really, sculpture had reached the same problem as painting in figurative technique. Yes, you could become a virtuosic Paganini of sculpture, or Bernini, but actually after that, what were you actually saying? So we're seeing a hermaphrodite in the pagan culture, and then you're seeing these dead bodies in the Christian culture. All of this has got something to do with death, and death of the male, and death of the female, death of the polarity of the sexes. So Baphomet, if we get to that, is this image of a hermaphrodite balancing the sexes, balancing the animal and the human, and so something that
Minotaur head and the body of a human. It's the vision of the Satanists of what their god.
So in fact, it's an emancipation of masculine and feminine polarity, and it's also like a judging scale.
So if you look for Baphomet, Georgia courthouse, then you can see the Satanists in the state of Georgia in America. PH. PH.
So Satanism and the cult.
So the Satanists put the giant statue of Baphomet outside the courthouse, Supreme Court of Georgia, the state in America, to test the religious freedom of the Constitution there, because they had the notion that, well, it's not a Christian country, this is a country with freedom of religion and freedom from this is the Georgia state house.
It's almost a copy of the Senate.
Yeah, this is in the American. No, they all have you not seen the 50 different state houses? I showed you 50 different state houses.
No,
they've all got this copy.
They're all the same Renaissance.
Yes.
Okay.
You can go, there's an interesting blog actually, we can go to it in a second, I'll find it, called like 50 state houses. And we'll scroll through. But
so this is devilish goat? So the cult of the goat comes from the satyrs and the Greek panegyria.
This is the Baphomet with the pentagram over his head, and he's there on a throne with a children worshipping and possibly being molested by him as sacrificial offerings.
And he's supposed to have female breasts. So I'm not sure this version.
And so this is the kind of classic statue of Baphomet type.
Well, they couldn't have sexual organs on display in the square, could
they? So they then erected this outside of the courthouses to
scare the living daylight out of
to then provide an opportunity for the Christians to have a battle about whether America is really a constitutional republic that's secular in the Constitution, or whether and hence whether they have freedom of all different kinds of religion, or whether the Christians are going to assert that actually Satanism is beyond the pale. And although we say in the Constitution that we have freedom of religion, we don't mean that.
Well, eyes wide shut. Basically, we're getting to the point now where, we're in lockdown. We are not allowed to do anything. We're not allowed to go and work, even to earn a living. We can sit at home and try and make money, doing tutorials on video chats. But actually what we are is stay-at-home prisoners in our own civilization. We've got to a standstill, and we've also got to a point where we're being replaced by these chimeras, these machines doing other things for us, and also at the same time we're becoming organ donors.
Yes. So to bring us back to where we were
yesterday, we got a call from
the NHS.
So
last Friday, we broadcasted the great 2020 body snatch about how between the 19th and the 20th of May 2020, 65 million people in Britain, assuming that let's put aside those who are already organ donors, all the people who are not organ donors then became organ donors at, let's say, midnight on the 19th to the 20th of May, and they were deemed by the NHS to have consented to becoming an organ donor while asleep. So this takes us on to this notion of contracts, and we're looking at social. We've been talking with Philip's
about the social contract.
With Philip's different modes of living and different ways of moving outside of the 9-to-5 box reality, and different means of creating a civilization, creating a society that functions,
and ways of living in architecture that isn't just, you know, some suburban box.
We've been looking at different kinds of social contract, and as we were discussing earlier, we're not read the social contract at school. We're not asked to assent to it. This is a different kind of contract. This is a one-sided contract where the state, society, civilization, in some regard, some institution has created a set of rules that we never consent to, but we have to then be inculcated into.
Yeah.
So so this undermines the notion of contract, which exists in common law. This idea that if I treat with you, we both make an offer to one another. We show all the terms and consequences of what those offers are. We both sign the dotted line. Then we have a valid contract between us, and we can, in full knowledge and consent, come to an understanding. That's what treating is. That's what contract is meant to do. And so this is this basis of common law, is the way that people interact with one another, the theory in this country and in America of how we should treat one another as citizens. But then we have sitting
Saxon
behind
law, Norman law, common law, and constitutional law.
So we have this sitting behind the way that we live. So we have these contracts we write with one another. We have these forms of treating, but then sitting behind that is the social contract, which we never signed up to, and yet we're expected to consent to without knowing.
I mean, you could be philosophical and say, "I didn't ask to be born," you know. I didn't,
as we were talking about with Danny Shine from the Social Experimentalist last Friday. So back to the great body snatch, as Philip mentioned, we have another element of this story that came about yesterday. So we have been signing up to the non-organ donor register, putting the yellow star on our back. Opt out. We're signing up to gain back control, assert the control back over our bodies,
ownership of your body, at least
the sovereignty, taking back control.
You know, you may not own your passport, but you certainly own your body.
Yeah, so
you thought until
the 19th of May.
Yeah.
So
that means if you smoke or do anything wrong to yourself,
we've got to live badly. We've got to live as bad.
Property.
Yeah, exactly. You're not keeping the terms of your leasing agreement of your organs.
So they ask you to fill out, do you smoke? You know, and you always think, maybe I'll just take. No, I don't. Just in case they don't give me that medicine because they think I'll write him.
But
off.
now it's the other way around. So you've got to prove that you've ruined your body with alcohol, tobacco, drugs, sex, all kinds of misbehavior, fatigue, cycling, overaction, because then you'll erode
the food that you eat.
Erode the asset value,
because then you've got nice organs.
You erode the asset value of your organs. So that when they choose to cancel your lease and take back Section 6 of your body, then they won't have any resources. So they might not bother with it. This is the kind of the tree frog.
So you get this guy from Northern Ireland saying, "Thank you very much."
So let's get to the story. But this is the tree frog mentality. Is this? It's the same with the Second Amendment in America of guns. So the idea is, okay, if you send a SWAT team to my house, if you send a tank or a helicopter gunship, I'm going to die, okay? Yeah. But the Second Amendment in the American Constitution says I have the right to bear arms, which means that I can defend my property a little bit. So the idea is the tree frog, right? The tree frog looks unlike the leaf he's sitting on.
Yeah.
And he's black and he's gold and he's orange and he's cyan and he's bright colors. And on the green leaf, he stands out to the birds of prey. Mm-hmm. Now, he does that not because he wants to hide, because he wants to hide in plain sight. He wants to say, here I am, I've got poison in me, so you could eat me, but you would die, so don't eat me. You could also, the gambit is, though, I'm also advertising myself. You could just kill me for the pleasure of killing me and then not eat me.
In nature, that
but then
work,
then you won't bother. So
Yeah.
I mean, cats do it, but they're domesticated and they're more like humans. But nevertheless, he advertises himself that I'm just trouble. Just don't target me. Go and pick on somebody you can eat. So the same thing with the right to, the same thing with the American right to bear arms. Okay, I got my Second Amendment rights. I got guns in my home. Don't target my home. Go target somebody else who hasn't, because they're there. You're going to knock them over.
Well, I wasn't going to build a shed without any bright blue colours on it, like someone else. You know,
and so what you're seeing with the organ donorship now is we're having to sign up and say, hey, we're here. We've got the yellow star of non-participation, but we're asserting sovereignty rights back to our bodies, and we then have to do the tree frog of saying, well, we've ruined our bodies so much you don't even want them back on our lease agreement.
You know, Kitchener says sign up to the
Britain, your country, and easy.
Yeah.
So we signed on Friday. We put into action the signing up on the anti-donor register. Then I got a missed call on yesterday, Bank Holiday Monday, from the organ registry to my phone, listed come up as organ registry on my tracker.
And then they didn't know why you were calling back.
So they called me. They didn't leave a message. I called them back, and then they said, well, we don't know why this Northern Irish guy said, well, we don't know why we called you, but it looks like you haven't successfully deregistered from
organ
donorship. So you're still technically an organ donor. Let's go through on the form again on the phone in order to like redo the process of you de-signing up from the organ registry. And I was then waiting for 14 working days, the letter to come through. And of course that letter was never coming through because they'd failed to sign me up.
I didn't get any response from them, so maybe I'm still an organ donor.
Well, we need to work it out and do another round.
I mean, it's just the principle. You know, I could donate my organs if I so wish. But to have that right taken away from you is like one of the reasons that my family left Russia, is that I wouldn't have to fight in the Russian Federation forces and have to forfeit my body for the cause
that you didn't believe
Putin, you know, who's invading foreign lands.
Or at the time, what Yeltsin.
Soviet sovereignty. I mean, I'm not going to fight for a state I don't believe in. And I don't think anybody should. I mean,
what we're getting to is this ring fencing of then these billions of dollars worth of assets. So 65 million people, all of which have then become the leased property of the state. You become a freeholder of your body rather than a sovereign body. So the freehold is your property law. You're free to hold it for now until we release
until we switch your ventilator off.
So what we're experiencing is it's constant encroachment of the free man on the land. This is the common law idea from Saxon law, that if without let or hindrance, you should be not interfered with by anyone else unless you wish to treat with them. They can make offers to treat with you, like, hey, how are you? But you're free to walk on by in a public place and not even engage with them, to keep your silence, to mind your own business. And as long as you're not infringing on their rights,
you're a free man on the land.
You're a free man on the land, and they can't interfere with yours. And that's same with the police, same with the authorities, same with other members
of course, as soon as you fall into the custody of the hospital, then you're,
now, of course,
at their behest.
What we're seeing almost daily now in this COVID 1984 reality is encroachments of that common law basis of public life.
Yeah, I mean, they take away your relative, you can't see him again, and you can't do anything to
you can't be the patient advocate. You can't be at his bedside. You can't then manage.
So that's how I've just lost my father, in exactly that way, because I couldn't be in the hospital and I couldn't go and speak to them properly. And when I did go and speak to them, they wouldn't let me into the ward because they said, you can go in there, you're going to compromise your life and your family members who had already been with my father. But basically, the point was that the hospital was in control of his life and, did all they could until obviously they couldn't do anything else. But I'm not even allowed to see a full report of what they actually did. So I can't even tell.
You didn't see the body.
I didn't see the X-ray. I didn't see the blood readings. All I did was phone nurses and get random readings, which made no sense.
So we were reporting it to our doctors who are in our circle,
who again don't have any experience in this.
They're just in different fields, but they're helpful to give a second opinion. And many people don't have this ability to use.
Yeah, so they thought I was a scientist when I was phoning them up, because I was asking all the right questions about the condition of my father, but obviously they wouldn't really want
engage.
To answer.
Yeah, they
wouldn't. When we recorded what they were saying, what they were basically saying is we're going to switch him off.
Well, we have the recording here.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to.
We won't go into it.
I'm just saying that I was completely out of control, and my father was completely out of control. And the last things he wrote were things like, "I'm thirsty, help me. The person next to me is dying in his own shit and vomit, and the nurse is refusing to clean this person, and the other person next to me has just died." And they're trolleyed out for the next client. That's what he wrote. So the state of affairs.
There's a notebook you provided to him in extremis.
Yeah, I put that notebook in his bag so he could find out what he actually
experienced in his last day.
And also he wrote an address to Putin saying, "Own up for the death of Nemtsov and the death of the people in the airplane," and many other things that he was very disillusioned by and very angry about in Russia, the country that he left for a better life, to a country that basically provided a place to die in, as it seems. Now, of course, there was also all the bits in between, the life and the support and working in university. But essentially, the world is in trouble, and we have no control over our own lives. And had it been me or you or anyone else, we'd have been in the same hospital, dying in our own vomit, and hoping for some water, and hoping for some bread, and probably hardly being given it. Even in the best of circumstances, the doctor said a lot of the patients don't make it to intensive care because they just die in the other wards.
In the triage.
But and so triage or not, he got a ventilator, but it was of no use. It was just a matter of time before.
As we found from Cameron Carl Siddell and his work in New York, high pressure ventilation damages the lungs of people in this position.
Well, we don't know what it does, but we know that the doctor described it to me as like being on the motorway with a high pressure as you stick your head out the window on a high speed. So you can't continue sustaining that amount of pressure on your body. Your organs fail, not only because of the virus, but because you can't even exhale. So you're building up carbon dioxide, acidosis. Your organs can't sustain a long. So this myth about, I don't know, like 3 or 4 people have survived weeks on the high pressure 100% SpO2. I don't know, but it seems to me like he didn't qualify for ECMO or whatever. But okay, there are people who are just dying without anybody really doing anything about it, other than trying to give them a machine and not learning about how to deal with the virus properly. And of course, I'm not saying it's easy.
On your dictaphone, they acknowledged they were treating what they see as pneumonia, while admitting that the treatment for pneumonia is not the responding to the disease they're seeing in front of them. They said, they're turning blue, like hypoxia, and they're saying it doesn't look like pneumonia, but we're treating it as pneumonia because the protocol says that's what we do.
But they have no other treatment, and they have no other idea about how to treat this. As far as we know, the whole world's medical science isn't capable, with all the laboratories and hospitals and high-tech gear in the Western countries and Eastern countries, to actually find a cure.
Well, they have people like Cameron Carl Siddell experimenting in New York with low pressure oxygen provision. You've got experiments with remdesivir.
Experiments are not
and with hydroxychloroquine, both as an early stage treatment. But this requires early stage knowledge of when it's coming on, so that you can get the drugs.
Early stage. My father went to the hospital and was not admitted or tested when he had symptoms, because they just said go home, even though the GP had written a letter expressly saying go to the hospital and get yourself tested. They hadn't the capacity to deal with the problem. And even if he'd been tested, he would have still died, most probably. And it's tragic, and there's nothing that can be done to stop this situation, apart from, trying to keep away from the infection. And we have no idea. And, people are dying every day. And all these great metropolises have been completely frozen down. a man has essentially been robbed of his function because all they can do is stay at home and do nothing.
So this is very interesting because we look at the two kinds of people who these messages are addressing. The first is the bourgeois office workers who can take an online terminal and work from home. And then there's
people getting
all the
paid
other
anyway
people
as well.
And
not doing anything.
Then there's all the other people
because they had a job, so they're better than us.
Who are street sweepers, who are logisticians, who move food around, who treat in hospitals, who also are journalists and politicians. These are exempted categories too. The social engineers and controllers are also people who've exempted themselves, despite all this controversy about Dominic Cummings. So what we see is a two-tiered system.
Well, somebody's got to sweep the streets.
Yeah,
we've got to collect the rubbish.
Yeah, somebody's got to keep the sewage system going and
absolutely.
The trains and so on. And so all of the functional logistical infrastructure in our society has to keep running. And so all of this stay at home is for the superfluous bourgeois who had office jobs that are now entirely unnecessary in a lean...
I'm a school teacher and I'm not allowed to be in schools.
In a lean economy of just the essentials.
I can teach online, but I'm faced with the fact that basically I can't be in schools and I can't be teaching anymore because people are overwhelmed with the video calls because they're in online school until 5 anyway. So these poor kids having to spend their whole day on the computer. It's bad enough. I mean, if I had any control of schools, I'd ban computers and phones in the classroom for a certain period of time, just to stop people from being completely attached to the wire the whole time, and give them a practical exercise like clay modeling or drawing, because you just can't concentrate when you've got this thing in your face all the time. We put the phones in a drawer and then give them back at the end of the lesson. But not because I'm a tyrant, but because I want people to learn and concentrate while they're doing the lesson. And I think it's fair enough to not have to be on the wire all day. And of course, we're doing our best as teachers online, and people are getting very frustrated with this, and it can't continue. Even after lockdown, I think, obviously it's easier than going to work by just switching your teacher on or off. But you need to be able to interact socially and not just be in a pod with your wire.
Well, this is back to our matrix pods notion of this of services being provided to you. You were talking about making your own food or housing versus going into box life, going into this with this
landlord,
box, with then having feeds, whether it's data feeds, whether it's food being fed through various pipelines into you as a box person in a matrix pod, ultimately, which is staying still, so your energy is not being used in the world, being disruptive, you're making trouble.
Chopped off.
You're then being boxed in, so you're not a troublemaker. You're not acting. You're not creating. You're there receiving and consuming these various feeds of pipelines, whether it be food or data or whatever. And you're not using those to go out in the world and build an empire. You're using them to provide comfort and lethargy and.
It's a prosthetic limb. It's a prosthetic world of not in the world, but the world coming into you. It's rape. I mean, you don't possess the information you're fed. You don't control it, and you don't know whether you believe it. I mean, do you learn your history from Wikipedia, or do you go from, the classroom to the out excursion to see the real thing? I mean, I always tried to go with my video camera as an art student into the real world to make statements and represent the real world that I saw with my eyes and hands, not through the kind of prism of theory in the library alone. And that's why, they're trying to make an academic course and making you write a thesis, but actually, you can be an illiterate artist. It's quite funny because a lot of the people in art school couldn't spell or read, but that was just...
Or have good handwriting, which is an artist you should.
Well, I mean, you can study calligraphy, but the bottom line was that you were not necessarily free to express things if you were not going out into the field and getting experience in the real world. Yeah.
So to draw some of this together, we can through via negativa, through through looking at what doesn't exist and what's not satisfactory and what we don't like, we can start to form some ideas about what might be a road out of this, what might be a beneficial way of living. And this, I think, is what we've got to get through this moment of doubt and pain towards coming to a realization.
How much money do you really need?
Of what we want to do with our lives. And we don't have, there's a generational shift that needs to occur that hasn't occurred of people of our age taking up the mantle of making things, making a society of our own, rather than, as you say, you go to school, you're presented with a set of hoops to jump through.
You're not given a social contract,
and not given a social contract, not given law, not given personal finance, not given how to balance your books, how to value your time and keep your time
how much
for yourself.
Are you worth an hour? How much are you worth an hour? Like, how much am I worth an hour? Because with one client, I'm worth 20 quid an hour, and the other one, I'm worth 85 quid an hour, and the other one seems to think that I can make a portrait of them for free
for the benefit of being in their company.
Yeah. So there's no such thing as a fixed value on art, and
we're not given as a tool set within the schooling system. We're not given a notion of all this financial value creating stuff or time management so that we can choose how we spend that time. And so that interaction between time and money is totally outside of our school reality, and so it's totally outside of anything that we come to, unless we come to it ourselves.
We're very lucky to have been sheltered by our families and given that education.
But we have all of this. We have all of this infrastructure around. We don't know exactly how it works. The
other point
we don't know how to sustain it.
Where did I go?
Which bits are necessary and functional, and which are superfluous.
And where did I go after art school and living in squats? I went to live in a flat and I asked for housing benefits. I was then getting the state, just like with my education, asking to borrow or receive grants of money to fill the gap between homelessness and being unemployed, or to help me on my way to becoming a good citizen and follow the social contract, pay my rent, go and get as much work as I could for the purpose of sleeping in a bed. The fundamental human right of sleeping, eating, and going to the toilet.
And just washing yourself.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which became, a very strange reason. It's not even like to feed your family. It was literally a reason to exist, was to go and become a slave.
To choose indentured servitude.
System,
so we're looking back at different forms of social reality, and we're looking serfdom now. We're talking about serfdom with regard to bodies, of the idea of being a tenant farmer on your own land, on your own body, not being a freeholder,
and then feeling the guilt of accepting money. At a certain point, I felt like, why should I be getting housing benefit when there are disabled people that it was designed for, or people that are really unable to work? So I came off that system. I don't want an applause for it, because I just think that every pound that I got was filling some kind of serious gap, and it's there for a good reason, because imagine if they didn't. You need to house people and give them a roof over their head. I think there's no excuse in rich countries like Britain or Sweden, where they have 5-star quality prisons. But there's no need for somebody to be homeless in a country that's producing billions of pounds worth of
excess value, surplus
value. In all sorts of sectors. But at the same time, it's a feeding tube with a contract, and you have to really know what you want from the system and what you're giving to the system,
and where that exchange point lies for you, and what you want out of it. You see, there's not this. We're not given the tools again to make that decision for ourselves. How much do I believe there's a risk profile to the coronavirus plague? Rather it's like a single one-size-fits-all policy, which then doesn't work in all the multifarious different cases and ways that people live. So we're not encouraged in our education to then make our own compromises and our own adjustments and judgments of how we interact with the state, how we interact with that social contract. and actually each person needs to make their own balance.
Well, as free men on the land, we should be able to decide what we actually,
the extent to which we engage at all.
What we actually do and what risks we're taking, and take on that responsibility.
Yes. And so, like with the organs, it's just a one size fits all. Well, okay, we'll land grab all of your body real estate now overnight, and you'll be deemed. This idea, you will be deemed to have consented. This is really the heart of where this social contract idea comes in. This idea of the non-consensual contract,
but also there's the moral values of civilization. I mean, the great things of civilization like architecture, music, art, philosophy, law, all these things have to exist, and even if it's very, very difficult, like I think Prince Charles was raising concern. He's got lots of funds that I benefited from in the drawing school, where he sponsored the royal funds sponsor the music schools like Purcell, the Royal Academy of Music. They sponsor the City and Guilds Carving School. They sponsor indeed all these things like the drawing school and the Prince's Foundation. But
this is private munificence rather than public good.
What he's saying is that there needs to be a harmony in society that provides a moral reason for arts to exist. That people have to take their initiative and responsibility to perpetuate the arts. And he's doing something in terms of paying for that.
Yes.
In terms of raising awareness with his book Harmony, for example. He might.
It's interesting. It's interesting to me that you, as a Russian coming from a sort of Republican scenario, then look to a king, look to a princeling as a means of.
Well, this is the way it works in this country. There's no other way in this country without the royal funding for institutions like the academies of arts and things to exist, because the Republican and the government funding is not enough. So the way that this works in England is that the royal family actually fill that gap. It might be different in the States, but actually I think the Prince's Trust US is now being launched. But somebody that went through coronavirus, Prince Charles, and survived, and then goes to conferences and bravely leads ahead an initiative for the future. Some concerns about what will happen with overpopulation and waste of materials and waste of resources in the future. And this is very interesting, because he could just be like the other kings of Europe, queens of Europe, that sit around and don't have any initiatives at all.
Yes.
I'm not going to point fingers, but there are a few monarchies I'm aware of that have no such thing. So, I mean, there is a space here in England in the future that will provide art institutions, art education, thanks to these funds. And, people like, were invited to Windsor Castle, and I was invited to draw there. And people were guests at the dinner at the price of, £10,000 to be with Prince Charles, to donate money to the Prince's Foundation.
Well, it's interesting that Beethoven wrote his resignation letter and emancipated artists in 1815 or so from the princes. He said, "Prince, there will forever and throughout history be thousands of princes. You are a prince only by dint of your birth,
right? Yeah.
Whereas throughout history there will only ever be one Beethoven." And that was his resignation letter, which emancipated music and art from this culture of patronage, where you had to be a servile kind of servant.
I think Frederick the Great had people writing music.
You had Mozart. You had Mozart sitting at the servants' table. Because he was in the servile class in the court.
Well, of course.
And his string quartets.
I mean, we got a voucher for Pizza Express at Windsor Castle. We don't get to sit with His Royal Highness, of course.
His music, his string quartets would be wallpaper music, like Muzak in Liszt's today, and there would be the sound of clattering knives and forks as the aristocrats ate, and these beautiful string quartets. We played against that, and so this whole notion of Beethoven, like emancipating the artist and making the artist into a named person rather than a nameless servant who creates, wallpaper or decoration.
Well, it's a sign
for
of
the
sophistication
for the life of the aristocrat.
In an aristocrat.
But now from this moment, you're saying that one of the few opportunities of reconstructing a civilization might be through royal patronage. So we're going back like
to
200 years,
country,
which we thought that the Eroica. We thought that Beethoven was taking us out of this.
Well, it probably
slavishness.
won't be, because Prince William hates classical music, which I think he's quite famous for saying, cowpat music or something like this. Prince Harry, probably won't be seen at the Wigmore Hall.
Well, he's turned into the Duke of Windsor. I mean, he's gone off to LA.
He's gone off, so that's not a problem. But there's Prince Michael, who's actually very active in the arts. But it takes people like them to be sophisticated enough to actually help the arts.
Well, like as you were saying, Russian bandits. The Russian billionaires in London they're not ancient Russian families, not intelligentsia like your family coming out of Russia. They're
new money.
They're divorced. They've taken the Gazprom and the steel and so on, and they've pocketed the profit.
Who knows how many people were killed between each other before they got the money.
But these people, even though they've come out of gangsterism, they have the Russian aspiration.
The boyarism.
They have the Russian aspiration of they want their children to learn French, ballet, chess, art, history, philosophy,
piano.
They instruments,
pilots.
They want their children, even though they're not of ancient stock in Russia,
and not necessarily
or of
genetic talent. Yeah,
but they've got the aspiration in them in London to put their children in a position where they are their culture. They think their son is going to be the prime minister. They're flame keepers. They're flame keepers. They're oath keepers of the civilization, of our Western civilization. And actually, Russia has become, and Russian people have become much better custodians of a lot of aspects of Western civilization than a lot of Western Europeans and Americans, which is quite astonishing. I mean, okay, you can see.
Well, they just had that kind of mentality left over from the French aristocrats who ran away and became les chers amoujnik. Like, mon cher ami, je parle d'argent, je voudrais travailler. And they suddenly had these French tutors tutoring Pushkin and whatever, who came across with the best that French aristocracy could offer to St. Petersburg.
Fleeing from the
Robespierre. And then suddenly, so these people like my grandmother, whose first language was French. In 19 something, 10. So what you're looking at is the perpetuation of an old European culture and old European moral values.
So I think in the next episode, in between now and then, we've got to start thinking of ways in which we can build, as we were saying, build
the new Athens,
build the new Athens, build the new generation. We need this. The new generation needs to take control of where this civilization is going to go.
I think we have to look at banks, and we have to look at money, and we have to look at what it actually is.
That's what the blockchain revolution was for, was to reassess where value lies.
And duty of value, and responsibility and moral value, and where that lies. And instead of having generations of people doing drugs and not knowing what to
consumers.
Deciding what sexuality they are, deciding what football team they support. They actually have to look at their life, the limited time in which we are here on the planet, because it is very short.
My father died at 65. Your father died at 71.
And look at themselves as a value, because it's only within a certain decade that you can have children. If you want to do that, there's only within a certain time that you can achieve
energy,
excellence in a field like, for example, the arts or anything else that you believe in doing. So and then there's a certain period before your teeth fall out. You're dead.
If you're a sportsman, you have to be a teenager. If you want to be a physicist, you have to be in your early 20s, because your brain gets into quantum physics.
It's about discipline and application.
if you want to make a new discovery, that is. And so you're right, there are certain ages of life and certain ages.
I think we've also been very lucky in our generation to have the cheap flights and be able to go around our grand tour, something that only the richest aristocrats would have afforded in the 18th century, and not all the artists would have ever seen Italy. Whereas now, you know, we can jet stop around. We could up until now. I don't know if this is going to be the case for the next generation. But we've been able to have freedom of passage with, you know, obviously thanks to the British passport that I got, or, you know, thanks to getting visas and things like this, to be able to go around and see the world and actually make your own opinion of history and art and history of art, your own opinion of languages through real experience. And then to take on that responsibility, because we are the only ones who can do that. You know, look at Ahmad sitting in Syria. He can't get a visa to go and see Rome, so he's vicariously looking at my pictures of Rome on Facebook. So not everybody on the planet has that liberty. So we need to take responsibility as a generation of people who have, up until we're robbed of it, the right of passage.
Yes, and the freedom to associate and the freedom to build. And we haven't taken up that.
And the freedom of information to learn online. Yes. Because that might go away too. And, you know, you just don't know what people are going to be learning and where do they start. I mean, a 3-year-old with an iPhone, that's what we're looking at today.
But that does happen. I mean, if you take toddlers and you give them an iPad or an iPhone, it's very intuitive. Their brains can build into that from zero.
Yeah, and they think of that as a given. I mean, we had to use pen and paper and dip ink when I was little. And suddenly, we go from a biro to telepathic communication or something like this, you know, being developed in America now.
Yes.
So we're going through changes. It's our responsibility to make sure that we do the right thing, make the right decisions.
Yes. So the question really is, what can we practically do?
Well, I mean, okay. It doesn't take much, and you have to be of a certain mentality to learn how to nail nails into a piece of wood. There you're using metal and wood. From there on in, you can learn how to use a screwdriver, and then you're looking at threads and tapping a thread and making, you know, joints. To use a saw, you know, sawing through a piece of wood, keeping a straight line. You don't need a machine to do this. You don't need a drill to drill a hole. You can actually do it with a corkscrew if you want. Understand the difference between the use of a power tool and a hand tool. Understand how to sharpen a chisel so that you don't have a blunt piece of metal. Understand that stone, metal, and wood, the way they behave, different melting temperatures, you know. So when I go into the classroom, I understand that those kids don't know the difference between gold and aluminium. They don't know the difference between steel and bronze. So it's my duty to say, well, you know, 1500 degrees centigrade for steel, you know, 300 degrees for aluminium, or is it? No, it's not aluminium, excuse me. There we go, teacher and liar. Lead, 300 degrees for lead, 1200 degrees to fire a glaze in ceramics, or 1100 degrees centigrade. You know, gold somewhere like 500 degrees. I might be wrong, but what I'm saying is get an idea in your head of how materials work. What is magnetism? What is electricity? How hard are these metals?
The Mohs scale.
The difference between hardwood and softwood. You know, the difference between using pine and oak. Get these things into your head. Take a pencil, sharpen the pencil, do observational drawing, understand shapes and lines, understand how to describe physically what you can see, and then once you've got a few of these practical skills, apply them to your ideas as an artist. You know, don't frown away from, sort of shying away from, oh no, that's a practical skill, I'm just an artist, I don't need to know. Actually learn through making something, and then that you can apply to building a shed in your garden, building an installation shed in your university. No, but really you can apply these skills.
And it's not tilting at windmills in the sense of this quixotic worthless notion of sort of worthless ambition to do something that's silly or out of date. Actually, it does have a relevance, and it's the start of an understanding.
Yeah, and take that away with you, and then not rely on the plumber who's going to come and say, "Oh yeah, that'll be 50 quid." What did you do? Oh, I just changed the fuse. You don't need a plumber to change the fuse. You may need a plumber to tell you to change the fuse. But once you know, you're going to pay someone 50 quid to change a fuse. It costs 30 pence.
Yes.
So that's where, you can learn some skills so you don't have to depend on other people all the time.
Yes. So we'll be looking on Friday in our next episode at some of the practical things we can do to assert power in the world, the ability to build, and what our generation should be aiming at building, whether that's in the sense of architecture in the built environment, whether that's in terms of money and in terms of value creation,
and building the new Athens,
whether we should be finding a physical location to create a breakaway civilization of our own to
avoid the mess that's going on.
Well, you've been creating little breakaway civilization kind of proofs of concept throughout your life. And what we need to be doing now is working out, is there a physical location where we can make this happen? Is there just nowhere for you to go? You're not allowed to be anywhere. There's nowhere left to be free. Anyway, thank you so much to Philip Fearsov. Thank you to Oliver Nelkin and Mornington Media for hosting us. And thank you from me, Laurenzo Mefsud. And have a very good week. I'll see you Friday evening for the live stream.
Thanks very much. Was that recorded? Yeah. Oh, right.